Welcome to White Shadows. Today I bring you the Boxing Day horror stories, so put on your earphones and turn in the lights. So here goes the first tale. The Silent Visitor on Boxing Day. It was the day after Christmas, a time when most families are still basking in the afterglow of the holiday celebrations. For the Harrisons, Boxing Day was supposed to be a quiet, restful day. The house was large and secluded, nestled in the woods far away from the town. It had been in their family for generations, a grand old thing with creaky floors and drafty halls. But it had always been home. That day, Sarah, the youngest daughter, found herself alone in the house. Her parents had gone to visit her aunt in the nearby village, and her older brother, Tom, was out hunting in the woods with his friends. It was just Sarah in the old house, with its thick wooden beams and its chilly corners. The fire in the living room was crackling softly, the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the house. At some point, as Sarah sat curled up in a chair with a book, she heard something strange, a faint knocking sound like someone tapping lightly on the walls. She put the book down and listened closely. The knocking seemed to come from upstairs, above her, just beneath the attic. It was an odd sound, too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like someone was counting. It was probably just the wind, she told herself. The house had its quirks. It groaned and moaned with age, especially on days like this when the temperature dropped. Sarah tried to ignore the noise and went back to reading, but then it came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 tap. Her heart skipped. She knew she was alone in the house. Or at least, she thought she was. But who else could be here? She didn't remember any of the staff coming by. She rose from her seat, unease creeping into her bones. Quietly, she made her way to the stairs and listened again. There was no one in sight. The hallways stretched out like dark tunnels, and Sarah's footsteps seemed to echo too loudly as she ascended the stairs. The sound continued, tap, 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 coming from the attic door at the end of the hallway. Sarah stopped, feeling a sudden chill. The attic had always been a place she avoided. It was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and something else. Her grandmother had always warned her to stay away from it. Never open the attic door, she had said. Not after dark, but that was just an old woman's tale, right? Sarah wasn't a child anymore. She was 17, and she could handle it. With her pulse racing in her ears, she approached the door, the faint tapping growing louder in the stillness. She reached out and turned the old brass handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but shadows. She stepped into the attic, the smell of dust and old wood thick in the air. The light from the hallway cast long, eerie shadows across the room. The tapping stopped abruptly. A movement caught her eye, something in the far corner of the room, a shape that shifted in the dim light. She froze. There on the far side of the attic was a figure, standing still, staring at her. The air seemed to grow heavier, and Sarah couldn't breathe. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, her face obscured by a tangle of dark hair. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her presence cold and suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind Sarah, and she screamed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When her parents returned later that day, Sarah was trembling, pale, and wide-eyed. She refused to speak of what she saw, but from that moment on, she was never alone in the house again. They say that on Boxing Day, the spirits of the house come alive. And that night, as the clock struck midnight, the old house groaned and whispered, but no one ever dared to open the attic door again. Hope you're not that scared, 'cause next one is scarier than this. The next tale is The Reflection in the Window. It was a quiet Boxing Day in the small town of Ashford. The kind of day where the sky was gray, and the air held that crisp bite that reminded you winter was in full force. Most people in the town were still recovering from the Christmas festivities, either resting or sorting through their holiday gifts. But for Emma, it was a different kind of day, one that would change everything. Emma had always loved the old house she grew up in. It was a charming cottage, tucked at the edge of the woods, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and an ancient oak tree standing watch in the front yard. The house was always warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and the crackling of the fireplace. But this Boxing Day, the house felt off. Maybe it was the isolation, as Emma had moved back in after her parents had passed away earlier that year. Or maybe it was the silence. There was no bustle of family, no laughter echoing through the halls. Just her, and the faint hum of the wind outside. After a long morning of tidying up and organizing some of her parents' things, Emma sat down with a cup of tea by the large window that overlooked the garden. The window, with its old, tarnished frame, had always been her favorite spot to sit and watch the world go by. But today, as she gazed out at the still, snow-covered ground, something felt strange. She noticed a shadow in the corner of the window, barely perceptible at first. It wasn't cast by the tree or any of the garden furniture. It seemed too dark, too solid. Emma leaned forward, squinting. The shadow was just outside the window, faint but growing. She could see the shape now, a person standing there, just beyond the glass. Her heart skipped a beat. How could anyone be out there? She hadn't heard the doorbell ring, and the only way to the house was through the long, winding driveway, which no one had driven up. She got up and moved closer to the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. There, standing perfectly still, was a figure. A man, tall, dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He was facing the window, unmoving, as if he were waiting for something. Emma's pulse quickened. Was it a neighbor? A passerby? Maybe someone lost in the snow? But something in her gut told her this wasn't normal. She instinctively took a step back, as though trying to distance herself from whatever was outside. Then, the man moved towards the window. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to the window. His fingers pressed against the glass from the other side, right where Emma had been standing just moments before. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. His reflection. Emma's heart dropped into her stomach. The reflection in the window didn't match the movement of his hand. The reflection was wrong. The man in the glass didn't have a hand pressed against the window. Instead, his reflection was smiling, his lips curling into a wide, unnaturally large grin. And his eyes, they were black, deep, empty voids, frozen in place. Emma could only watch as the man's reflection began to move independently of his body. His reflection leaned closer to the glass, its grin widening even further, its hollow eyes locked on her. It pressed its face against the window, its breath fogging the glass as it whispered something. Emma couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the chilling breath on her skin, as though the thing in the window was right behind her. Terrified, Emma stumbled backward, knocking over her cup of tea, but her eyes were glued to the reflection. The man outside hadn't moved, but his reflection in the window seemed to be laughing now. A low, guttural laugh that sounded as if it was coming from all around her, echoing through the walls. Emma. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was a whisper, and it was coming from the reflection, as though the thing in the window was speaking directly into her mind. Let me in. The word sent a shiver down Emma's spine. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the reflection, which was now staring directly at her, its smile impossibly wide, stretching from one side of its face to the other. The man outside didn't move, his body still standing rigid, frozen in place. "Let me in." With a final, horrifying smile, the reflection began to press its face against the window harder, its form distorting, warping as if it were trying to reach through the glass. Emma ran. She bolted from the window, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she scrambled through the house. She didn't stop to grab anything, just ran. She needed to get out, but when she reached the door and opened it, there was no one there. The yard was empty, no man in sight. She stepped outside, breathing in the cold air, her heart pounding in her chest. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, her imagination playing tricks on her. Maybe she was simply exhausted, worn down by the holiday season. Whatever the reason, she packed her things, left the house, and never returned.